My name is Rachel, and 3 weeks ago, my mother called me to say I wasn't welcome at my own sister's wedding. Not, we need to talk. Not, there's been a misunderstanding. Just a flat, rehearsed sentence, like she'd practiced it in the mirror. Your father, and I think it's best if you don't come. For the sake of peace. Peace. That was the word she used. As if my presence at a wedding was an act of war. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I said, okay, and I hung up. What my parents didn't know, what none of them knew, was that 3 days before the wedding, they would be sitting in my living room, on my couch, begging me for $38,000. This is that story. Stay until the end, because the ending is not what you think. To understand how I ended up uninvited from a wedding I helped pay for, yes, you heard that right, you need to understand my family. I'm the older daughter. My sister, Melissa, is 2 years younger. Growing up, there was always an invisible line drawn down the middle of our house, and I was always on the wrong side of it. Melissa got the dance classes. I got told dance classes were a waste of money and that I should focus on grades instead. Melissa got a car for her 17th birthday. I worked 2 jobs through high school and bought my own used Honda with 11,000 miles already on the odometer and a check engine light that never turned off. I'm not telling you this to sound bitter. I'm telling you this because it matters later. Every dollar, every sacrifice, every no I heard growing up built the person who, years later, would have the resources to save my parents from complete financial ruin and the resources to decide whether I wanted to. My parents, David and Linda, were never cruel in an obvious way. It wasn't yelling. It wasn't slamming doors. It was quieter than that. It was Linda introducing Melissa first at family gatherings. It was David remembering Melissa's cheer competitions, but forgetting my college graduation was the same weekend as one of Melissa's tournaments, and choosing the tournament. I left for college on a full scholarship. Full ride, no debt, because I refused to ask my parents for a cent I knew they'd resent giving me. I studied finance. I was good at it, obsessively good, the way people get when they've spent their whole childhood being told they're the responsible one instead of the loved one. Being responsible was the only currency I had in that house, so I spent my whole life earning it. By 28, I was a director at a mid-sized investment firm in Chicago. By 31, I'd started my own small advisory practice on the side, helping working families manage retirement accounts and small business owners get their finances in order. It did well. Better than well, actually well enough that by 34, when this story really begins, I had done something my parents had no idea about. I had quietly become the person who bailed my family out of trouble. Multiple times. And they never once said thank you the way you'd say thank you to someone you respected. They said thank you the way you'd say thank you to an ATM. Let me give you the receipts, because a story like this needs receipts. For years before the wedding, my father's small hardware store, the one he'd run for 22 years, nearly went under during a slow season. He needed $18,000 to cover payroll and a supplier debt, or he'd lose the store. He didn't call me. He called Melissa, who didn't have it, who then called me, crying, begging me to just talk to Dad. He's too proud to ask you directly. I wired the money the next morning. No interest. No contract. My father never once looked me in the eye about it. He referred to it, forever after, as a rough patch we got through. 2 years before the wedding, Melissa's fiancé, the man she was about to marry, lost his job right after they signed a lease on an apartment they couldn't afford alone. Guess who covered 3 months of rent so my sister wouldn't have to move back in with Mom and Dad and lose momentum in her career? $12,000. Again, no thank you card. Just my mother saying, see, this is why family helps family, as if I were fulfilling an obligation rather than performing an act of generosity. 1 year before the wedding, my mother needed a procedure that their insurance didn't fully cover. $9,000 gone, quietly, no questions asked, because what kind of daughter lets her mother suffer over a bill? By my count, in the 4 years leading up to that wedding, I had given my family just under $40,000 combined. $40,000 of my own money, earned from years of working weekends while Melissa was at brunch, invested carefully, spent generously, and never once acknowledged with anything more than a transactional thanks. And every single time, I told myself the same thing: this is what family does. This is what love looks like when you're the one who has it and they're the ones who need it. I didn't yet understand that in my family, love wasn't something you gave. It was something you were assigned to produce, like a factory line, without ever being allowed to receive it back. When Melissa got engaged, I was thrilled for her. I mean that honestly, whatever resentment simmered under the surface of our relationship, I loved my sister. I'd always been the one who showed up for her, even when the roles felt uneven. The wedding was going to be enormous. A destination event at a vineyard 2 hours outside the city, 220 guests, a live 12-piece band, a dress that alone cost more than my first car. My parents had committed to paying for it, a fact they announced proudly at Sunday dinner, like it was the most natural thing in the world for two people who, for years earlier, couldn't cover payroll at a hardware store. I didn't say anything at the time, but I did the math in my head. And the math didn't add up. It turned out, and I only learned this later, piecing it together from things my mother let slip, that my parents had taken out a home equity line of credit to fund the wedding. Nearly $90,000, most of it earmarked for the venue, the catering, and Melissa's dress, with the rest meant to cover a honeymoon in the Maldives that Melissa had been not so subtly hinting about on social media for months. They never asked me to contribute. Not directly. But 6 weeks before the wedding, my mother called and asked, very casually, if I had any interest in helping out with the flowers, since you're so good with budgets. I said I'd think about it. 2 days later, I transferred $8,000 for the florals and the welcome dinner, because, again, this is what I do. This is who I had trained myself to be. So by the time the wedding rolled around, I had already put $8,000 into this event, on top of the roughly $32,000 I'd given my family over the previous years. Total, right around $40,000, though I want to be precise here, because precision matters in this story. The figure my parents would later beg me for, the $38,000, was a separate and much larger crisis I didn't yet know was coming. 3 weeks before the wedding, everything changed. It was a Tuesday evening. I remember because I was making dinner, one of those nights where you're standing at the stove half listening to a podcast, feeling, for once, like life was calm. My mother's name lit up my phone. I answered with my shoulder while stirring a pan of vegetables. "Hey, Mom." There was a pause. A pause I now recognize, in hindsight, as the sound of someone reading from a script they didn't want to say out loud. "Rachel, honey, we need to talk about the wedding." "Okay," I said. "What's up? Do you need me to handle the seating chart or something?" "No," she said. "It's, your father and I have been talking, and we think, given everything, it would be best if you didn't come." I turned the stove off. I remember that specifically, the click of the dial, because it felt like the only thing in that moment I had control over. "I'm sorry, what?" "It's not personal," she said quickly, the way people say it's not personal right before delivering the most personal thing they will ever say to you. "Melissa is worried about tension. She wants the day to be about her and Jake, and she thinks having you there might create some awkwardness with certain family members." "What family members?" A hesitation. "Then, your Aunt Carol mentioned some things you said at Thanksgiving. About money. About feeling used. Melissa doesn't want that energy at her wedding." Let me pause the story here and tell you exactly what I said at Thanksgiving, because it matters. At Thanksgiving, my Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, a woman who has never once offered to pay for anything in her life, had made an offhand comment about how lucky Melissa was to have parents who could afford such a lavish wedding. I said, quietly, mostly to my plate, "It helps when your older daughter's been quietly funding the family for 4 years." I wasn't shouting. I wasn't making a scene. I was tired, and it slipped out, the way true things slip out when you've been holding them in for too long. Apparently, that single sentence, spoken at low volume, to a plate of turkey, was enough for my mother to decide, 3 weeks before the wedding, that I was a liability. Not my father's mismanaged finances. Not my sister's lavish spending. Me, the one footing the bill. So let me get this straight, I said, my voice very calm, calmer than I felt. I'm not invited to my sister's wedding because I mentioned, one time, that I've given this family thousands of dollars? It's not about the money, Rachel. It's always about the money, Mom. It's just never been about my feelings regarding the money. She didn't have a response to that. She just said, we'll send you something nice from the registry, if you'd like to still get her a gift, and then, before I could say another word, she said she had to go, dinner was burning, and hung up. I stood in my kitchen for a long time after that call. Not crying. Just calculating. Recalibrating, the way you do when a piece of information changes the entire shape of a problem you thought you understood. I want to be clear about something, because this is where a lot of stories like mine go wrong in the telling. I did not plan revenge that night. I didn't scheme. I didn't call a lawyer or draft an elaborate plan for humiliation. What I did was much simpler and much more devastating because it wasn't an act of cruelty. It was an act of stepping back. I opened my banking app. I looked at three things. 1. A standing automatic transfer of $600 a month I'd set up 2 years earlier to help my parents cover their HELOC payment after the hardware store crisis, a temporary arrangement that had quietly become permanent. 2. A pending wire transfer of $8,000 scheduled to go out in 5 days for the wedding florals and welcome dinner. 3. A verbal agreement, nothing in writing, because family doesn't need contracts, right? That I would cover the $12,000 difference between what the venue actually cost and what my parents' HELOC could stretch to cover, a gap my mother had mentioned to me in passing just 2 weeks earlier, clearly assuming I would quietly fill it the way I always did. I canceled the automatic transfer. I canceled the pending wire for the florals. And I said nothing. I didn't call to yell. I didn't post anything online. I didn't tell Melissa what our mother had done. I simply, quietly, stopped being the family's financial safety net 3 weeks before the largest financial commitment they had ever made. I'm not going to pretend I felt nothing. I felt everything. I felt 30 years of being the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who was loved conditionally on her usefulness, crystallize into a single, clear thought. I am done paying to be tolerated. Here's what I learned later, after the fact, mostly from Melissa, who, despite everything, was the one who eventually told me the full truth. The HELOC my parents had taken out was structured with an interest-only period that was about to end. My father, who had never been particularly financially literate despite running a business for 2 decades, hadn't fully understood that the low monthly payment he'd been so pleased about was about to balloon. When my automatic $600 contribution disappeared and the introductory period on the loan ended in the same week, the math simply stopped working. Then the florist called about the missing deposit. Then the catering company, which required final payment 10 days before the event, called about a check that bounced. Then the venue coordinator called my mother directly and said that without the remaining balance, the exact $12,000 my mother had quietly assumed I would cover, they would lose the venue entirely, non-refundable deposit included, 3 days before 220 guests were set to arrive. My parents had built an entire wedding on the assumption of my continued, silent, uncompensated labor. And when I removed myself from the equation, the structure didn't bend. It collapsed. 3 days before the wedding, my doorbell rang at 7:40 in the evening. I opened it to find both of my parents standing on my porch, and I want to describe their faces to you exactly as I remember them, because I will never forget it. My mother looked like she'd been crying for hours and trying to hide it with makeup that had long since stopped working. My father looked older than I'd ever seen him, not just tired, but hollowed out, the particular exhaustion of a man watching a lifetime of quiet self-image crumble in real time. "Rachel," my mother said, "can we come in?" I let them in. I didn't gloat. I want you to understand that I felt no triumph standing in that doorway. I felt sad, mostly. Sad for the little girl I used to be, who would have done anything to hear her mother say her name with that much need in it. We sat in my living room. My mother did most of the talking, though it took her nearly 10 minutes to get to the point, circling around apologies that weren't quite apologies. We didn't mean for it to come across that way. You have to understand the pressure we were under. Melissa didn't even know what I said to you. I never told her before finally, my father, who had said almost nothing, looked up and said the number. We need $38,000, Rachel. By Friday. Or the wedding doesn't happen. 38,000. The venue balance. The caterer. The florist deposit they'd assumed I'd already covered and hadn't realized had bounced. A vendor penalty for late payment. It had all compounded in 72 hours into a single unbearable number. I sat there for a long moment. I let the silence stretch, not out of cruelty, but because I needed it. I needed to feel, fully, in my own home, on my own terms, what it was like to have my parents need me more than they had ever, in my entire life, wanted me. 3 weeks ago, I said, you told me I wasn't welcome at my sister's wedding because I mentioned, quietly, at Thanksgiving, that I've been financially supporting this family for years. And now you're sitting in my living room asking me to financially support this family for the wedding I'm not invited to. My mother started crying. My father just stared at the floor. Do you understand, I continued, how that sounds? We're not asking as a favor, my father said finally, his voice rough. We're asking because we don't have anywhere else to go. The bank won't extend more credit. We've asked everyone we can ask. And there it was. The truth underneath the truth. They hadn't come because they loved me, or missed me, or regretted excluding me. They had come because I was, as I had always been, the only reliable resource in a family built on appearances it couldn't afford. I told them I needed the night to think about it. They left around 9 p.m., my mother hugging me at the door in a way that felt, for the first time in years, less like affection and more like negotiation. I didn't sleep much that night. I thought about every dollar I'd given, every silence I'd swallowed, every time I'd told myself that being useful was close enough to being loved. And I thought about Melissa, who I genuinely believed hadn't orchestrated any of this, who was, in her own way, just as much a product of our parents' favoritism as I was a victim of it, groomed to receive without ever learning to notice what was being given up to provide it. The next morning, I called my sister directly, not my parents. I told her everything. The Thanksgiving comment. The disinvitation. The years of quiet payments. The $38,000 sitting on my parents' shoulders like a collapsing roof. Melissa was silent on the phone for almost a full minute. Then she said, quietly, I didn't know any of that. About the money. About any of it. I thought Mom and Dad just had it. I never asked because I didn't want to know. I believed her. I still believe her. So here is what I decided, and I want to explain my reasoning, because I think it matters more than the number itself. I did not give my parents $38,000. I offered Melissa a $15,000 wedding gift, directly to her, in her name, for her and Jake to use however they chose, whether that meant scaling back the vineyard wedding to something they could actually afford, or using it toward a life together instead of a single day. Not to my parents. Not laundered through their crumbling credit line. To my sister, as an act of love that had nothing to do with obligation. And I told my parents, calmly, over the phone, that I would not be covering the remaining balance on a wedding I had been explicitly, deliberately excluded from. I told them that if they wanted a relationship with me going forward, it would need to be built on something other than my checkbook, because I was done being valuable only in the ways that cost me something. The vineyard wedding, as originally planned, did not happen. The venue kept the deposit. My parents had to have an honest conversation with Melissa and Jake about what they could actually afford, probably for the first time in this family's history. What happened instead, 3 weeks later, was smaller. A backyard ceremony at my aunt's house, not Aunt Carol, a different aunt, one who'd offered without being asked, with about 40 guests, a rented arch, a caterer who did barbecue instead of a 12-piece band, and a 5-course meal. I was invited. Melissa called me herself this time, no script, no careful phrasing. She cried on the phone and told me she wanted me there, not as a financial contingency, but as her sister. I went. I stood two people back from the front, and I watched my little sister marry a man who loved her in a yard full of string lights instead of a vineyard full of debt, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, like I belonged somewhere in that family without having to pay for the seat. My parents were there too. We haven't fully repaired things. I won't pretend this story ends in some tidy, movie-perfect reconciliation. My mother still occasionally hints, in that same careful, rehearsed way, about how things have been tight lately. But something fundamental shifted the day I said no. They learned, for the first time, that my generosity had a floor. And I learned that love which only shows up when it needs your wallet was never love to begin with, it was accounting, dressed up in family photos. I don't regret the $15,000 I gave my sister. I regret the $32,000 I gave before I understood what I was buying with it, a seat at a table that was never really set for me. If you're the responsible one in your family, the one who always gets called when something breaks, I want you to hear this clearly. Being needed is not the same as being loved. And you are allowed to stop paying for a place setting that keeps disappearing the moment you stop being useful. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Has your family ever made you feel like your value was tied to what you could give them rather than who you are? I read every single comment, and I promise you, you are not alone. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.